Andrea. I will give you a brief introduction to the new climate economy project, issues of the decarbonization concept. Just the first introduction. This initiative was taken by a number of governments about 3 years ago, who wanted to change the economy. And you see on the slide here the countries that have been commissioning it. The approach taken was to establish a global commission, and a global commission of people associated with climate change or sustainability, but really mainstream decision makers and ex-decision makers. So it's former heads of state and former finance ministries, not active, very much active business representatives, CEOs and senior representatives from various firms. The chairman, Felipe Calderon, and then you that the SEI, my institute, together with 7 other institutes, are responsible for delivering the actual research. And here you see the current membership of the commission, where we have quite a nice balance across public and private sector, and also across east, west, north, and south. The reason the project came about was, firstly, Norway, UK, and Sweden felt that we have to do something to get the climate negotiations on track. That there is too much of resentment and problems around the climate negotiations. There was a sentiment that it's all about damages, it's about constraints, it's about losses, it's about burden, it's about guilt. But isn't there also transitioning the economy? Is it really so difficult or impossible to combine a good economy and climate change? And those of us that have worked in this, we feel that it is not so difficult. As the member of parliament in the previous panel said, that it's huge cost to society, an immense challenge to get this going. Perhaps that is, but the tide is turning very quickly now, and perhaps it is possible to combine economic growth and climate change. Meanwhile, most mainstream economic models do show that it is costly to GDP to put on a climate constraint, but the big general equilibrium models also have their constraints, and there are things in those models such as innovation, structural change, etc., which are not so easy to capture in a global model. And that's actually where a lot of the positive opportunities emerge. With the thing has been that you find yourself in a sort of an optimum situation, and then you impose a climate policy, and then you get something that is worse. But I think we all recognize today that we are not in an optimum, and nowhere in the world actually, that each region in the world is struggling with deep issues related to unemployment, stagnation, infrastructure, etc. And these challenges look a little bit different in different parts of the world, but still there are major challenges. And the question is, will the fossil-based economy show us the way, or would a low-carbon pathway actually create a better performance to get us out of these challenges? We still have a significant emissions reduction requirements in order to meet the 2-degree scenario. So you see here from last year, this should be updated now with the INDCs, but I have that. But as you see, the emissions gap here is about 27 gigatons in 2030. So a significant challenge, and how economic systems meet that at the global level? Well, today we actually see for the first time in 2014 that the footprint of the world did not increase despite the the global GDP growing. But most of this had to do with China and the structural change that is going on in China, and also the reduced production intensity in their car structure. New climate economy focused on 3 systems in particular, cities, land use, and energy, with the dominant share of global emissions. I would also like to add here that I think there is good reason to add industry as a fourth sistering, and other industrial parts need to be brought forward more prominently as we go forward in the new climate economy. But I will mention a couple of results related to energy and city. So starting with energy. First, we see now how the renewable energy very rapidly. We see that for the first time in 2013 that the clean energy investments added capacity was larger than fossil fuel added capacity. You can of course discuss whether the forecasts here are believable, but it was a landmark moment where the added electricity was more renewable than fossil in 2013. This was at the level in US dollars, and part of this has been driven by this new development of green bonds as well, where in 2014 we have 37 billion US dollars issued in green bonds, which was threefold a year, and this is something we see really is taking off. Of course, this is also driven by the cost reductions. For instance, the solar photovoltaic has reduced enormously in price over the last 10 years. Even in the last 5 years, we've seen an incredible decrease. The cost reductions here are well known around the world in good locations such as southern US, that utility scale projects are at very low prices. Even without subsidies, you can be definitely competitive with fossil fuel. That's a new situation and a game changer for energy industry. The wind costs have also gone down over time, more slowly, but it is clear that it's a steady curve of reduction, and we find now that in many auctions the wind energy bids are 30%, the coal and gas bids. So you can get bids at $45 per megawatt hour up to $100 per megawatt hour. Also very competitive. Conducted a similar analysis on the costs of electric vehicle batteries, which is now a sort of a momentum in the transport side of things, where we find that most policy on old, outdated data, which is very easy because if you're 1 or 2 years behind in what you're looking at in terms of point. By 2020, we might reach cost parity. Perhaps 2025 is almost guaranteed that we reach cost parity with the internal combustion engine. Technology shifts are really changing the playing field for how it's possible to combine climate change action and economic performance. Not to be overly optimistic, we still see invest fossil fuel in the energy sector overall. You still have 7 fossil fuels. So this is, of course, oil and gas. Which on the electricity side, we see things have progressed more strongly. Problematic how a development strategy is rapidly turning into something that is less energy secure and less viable as an economic option. On this slide, you see how for both China and India, the previously very energy secure option of coal is rapidly turning into something that is very import dependent. India is now crossing the threshold of that needs to be imported to cover coal demand. Of course, this is also related to the subsidies that were mentioned, that how we are frequently complaining about renewable subsidies and we need a level playing field, but the fact is that the renewable subsidies are only about 20% given out to fossil fuels around the world. And most of this is on the consumption side, actually, in developing countries. But there is a lot to be done to shift this playing field. Very promising opportunity given the low oil prices today. A lot of countries are reducing or even eliminating their subsidies. And let's just hope and work and strive for this. But for instance, Mexico and Indonesia have done tremendous advancements here. And we see, I think, in the IEA estimates that the overall level of subsidies are also, and not just because of the price effect, also because actual policy reform. But to move this system further, we need better financing. More investments need to be generated, and we need better financing options. We think that there is a big scope for public-private cooperation, and then we could get the financing costs to come down quite a lot compared to today. The year investment could reduce annual emissions by around 5.5 to 7.5 gigatons. So this is about 25% of that emissions gap that I mentioned before. Recognize that energy assets are changing, and it's not the same financing climate, the same investment climate that we had when we were talking about the centralized fossil fuel assets. These have different. The old system of electricity generation was highly centralized. It had to deal with volatile fuel prices, high operating costs, very large-scale projects. Now we're moving into projects, actually projects at different scales. Very high capital cost, upfront cost, but very little cost, operating cost. Needs to be followed by new risk investment models from the financial community. And this is one of the areas where NCE is currently making a big research effort in how do the investors look upon renewable energy finance, and how can it be further facilitated at the European level. The second area, of course, is it possible to combine climate mitigation and economic performance here? And then when you talk about cities, it's not just about growth, it's about cities being competitive and attractive, and social inclusion, reducing emissions levels of air pollution, reducing adverse health impacts, inducing innovations, and making cities more safe and to be in. This is an estimate that shows that they're both saving emissions, saving investments actually, and saving costs over time, but it's very sensitive to energy costs and also very sensitive to discount rates. But our estimates are possible to make another big dent in the emissions gap here, potentially around 15%, by making investments in low carbon transport, buildings, and waste sectors. So this is why cities are becoming more and more interesting, I think also at the COP level and the global scale. We can read investment requirements. Here, $3 trillion, that's in the context of infrastructure overall requirements being around $90 trillion. So it's a significant reduction also, primarily due to the fact that we would advocate a more compact, connected city development model. And here I think about spreading the European model of urban development. And this slide compares two cities of comparable size, Atlanta and Barcelona. And you see here population, but the carbon emissions associated with these different cities are only 15% or so. So here is a huge potential for the place where Europe can actually make a contribution globally. Is this a new market for Europe, an export opportunity for European knowledge-intensive companies? World. Because the prevailing model in emerging economies is very much the American urban sprawl, uninformed and uncontrolled sprawling city development, which carbon impacts, but huge inefficiencies that are constraining the economic ability of these cities, as well as creating a lot of social problems. This tries to sum up a little bit the investment needs that we found in the global modeling we did. So the red is the base business as usual case up to $20 trillion, and we find that at the far right side, the low carbon scenario, the mitigation scenario, adds up to $93 trillion investment. So yes, a lot of money, but it's actually a marginal change. So it's really about shifting the mainstream of investment and not necessarily just dedicated investment. And you can see the breakdown here, investments in energy efficiency, investments in low carbon power generation, but then you have some reduced fuel infrastructure, some reduced investments in electricity transmission and distribution, and reduced investment because we can build our cities in a more compact, and the effect becomes around 5% increase in upfront investment cost, something that's clearly offset by the lower operating costs over time. We see now how the world is becoming more and more interested in combining climate action and economic potential, and we're rising, where of course Europe has been a front runner. But we now have 40 countries or regions underway or ongoing with carbon pricing. This is covering around 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it is spreading. Important to draw experience and how to not repeat the mistakes of the ETS, but to try to get it right from the beginning. Business side, it's also enormous interest. This graph shows that the Climate Leadership Index that outperformed the general index by 9.1% over last week with a meeting with one of the major Swedish pension funds, AP4, which has pursued a decarbonization strategy over the last 3 years. And so they took the SP5, they removed the 150 most carbon inefficient companies from that index, and they invested in the rest in a sort of an index portfolio. And by removing those 150 companies and the better ones, they improved the result by 1% per year. And they reduced the carbon footprint of the investment by 50%. So it's clear to combine, let's put it like that, good economic performance and good climate action also at the business level. So also at the national level, I think it's useful to remind ourselves that we've had action for a number of years. And some countries have been moving towards a sustainable and introducing carbon tax 25 years. And it's interesting to see how it's the same countries that show up when you talk about the best environmental performance, the best innovation competitiveness performance. It's the same company, it's the same countries that show up. So I think we have to make more of the point that it's clearly not incompatible, at least. And I think this is because that there is a sense of a changing conversation. This is my last slide. You can read some of the quotes here. My worry now is that only felt at the national level, and I think at the European level, I'm not sure it's felt properly. The negotiation tracks are so institutionalized and ingrained that it's difficult to break through with new evidence of the possibility to combine. And I think it's very promising to see initiatives such as decarbonization pathways, etc., are taken, is really showing the way forward. Thank you very much.